And so our second presenter is Dr. Madie Wensley. Madie is from Michigan, and she attended Michigan State University and obtained her Bachelor's of Science degree in Animal Science, then went on to Kansas State University, where she completed both her master's and PhD in applied swine nutrition. Her research while at K-State focused on feed management strategies to improve the weaning transition with the goal of decreasing mortality. Madie joined Pipestone Nutrition in January of 2023, and her primary role today is sow farm diet formulation and nutrition research oversight. Please help me welcome Dr. Madie Wensley.
Well, good morning. I know I'm the only thing standing between you guys and lunch, so have about a 20-minute talk, and then we'll have some time at the end for some questions. So it's a privilege to be here with you guys today. As Mark mentioned, I am currently with Pipestone, and so most of my role today is on the sow side, but during my master's and PhD program, I primarily focused on the wean pig and how we can, on a nutrition feed management side, reduce that period of nutrient disruption that occurs at the time of weaning. All right, so most of what I'm going to cover today would be a result of my dissertation while I was at K-State. And so where we're going to start is just looking at mortality. So when we look across the United States swine industry, mortality, we can all agree, is not where we want it to be. There is opportunities to improve mortality at every phase of production. Specifically honing in at the nursery pig portion of production, what we've seen since 2017 is a steady uptick in our nursery mortality. 2022, we were nearly at 4.5%. Since then, we have seen a little bit of a decrease, and hopefully we can continue to see that as we finish off 24 and move into 25. But the question with this uptick was, why is this happening, and what can we do from a nutrition standpoint to reduce mortality? And so K-State and several other universities partnered with National Pork Board on a grant, the survivability grant. And so that's where a lot of the data that I was able to work on during my program stimulated from. And so if we take a step back, and before we even get to mortality and start to talk about those pigs that eventually become a mortality, that leads us to fallback pigs. So I don't need to necessarily define for you guys what a fallback pig is. You know that, but I will. It's this pig that has relatively low feed intake at the time of weaning and fails to achieve similar production to that of its pen mates. And so this pig is typically characterized by gaunt flank, rough hair coat, droopy eyes, listless ears, and the list goes on. And so when we start to think about the factors that affect or cause a fallback pig, we can think about health, poor management in the barn. It can be feed related, and then what we'll talk about later in the presentation is the genetic potential. And so when we look across all these factors, there is one thing in common between all of them, and that is stress. So whether it's a biological stressor from pathogen exposure, it's a specific stress event that is occurring like weaning, or it's a predisposition to stress, all of them are stressful to the animal and then have subsequent impacts on that animal. And so the question is not how do we prevent fallbacks, it's how do we eliminate or lessen the amount of stressors that pig's facing leading up to and immediately post-weaning. So I just want to really briefly highlight the stress response pathway for you guys. The stress response pathway is controlled by the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. And so when a stress event occurs, this axis is triggered, which causes the hypothalamus to release corticotropin releasing factor. And then once that's released, there's a whole downstream effect that occurs that ultimately the body's job is to bring that animal back to a state of homeostasis. And so when we look at weaning, we have stressor on top of stressor on top of stressor, so several concurrent stacked stressors on top of each other. And what we've seen in human data, as well as in a lot of Dr. Adam Mosier's work at Michigan State, is that when these stressors occur one right after the other, especially in a young pig who is underdeveloped, this can lead to a hyperactive stress response that carries through with that animal through its entire production life cycle. So today what I'm going to share with you guys is maybe not new strategies, but it's an emphasis on strategies that work to help eliminate and minimize the number of stressors that are occurring at weaning. And so the very first one that I'm going to talk about today is wean age. Nothing new. We've talked about wean age for years. And so there was at one point years ago where we moved to a younger wean age pig because from a health standpoint, we thought that was better. But over the years, probably the last 10 or so years, we've started talking about, well, that's maybe not the best choice for the young pig. And so working with Pipestone, the goal is let's make decisions based on research. And so internally, they did a wean age trial looking at what if we wean a young 20-day-old pig versus a 25-day wean-old pig. And let's track performance. We know from Adam Mosier's work that younger pig struggles at a gastrointestinal level. And so what does that mean for the productivity of that animal? And so in the first 7 days, what we saw is that by weaning an older pig, we were able to significantly improve feed intake. And as a result of that, there was a tendency for improved gain with no differences in feed efficiency. And so then you track the performance of that pig throughout its entire productive life cycle to market. And what we saw is no difference in market weight, about 1.5 pounds heavier pig, but a significant difference in days to market. So those pigs got to market about 5 days faster. You could argue 5 more days in the farrowing house meant 5 less days in the nursery or wean to finish site. Yes, but that 5 extra days can mean a lot to a producer who's looking at refilling a barn. The other point, again, not significant, but can in some instances mean something, is an extra full value pig. So the next strategy we're going to touch on is creep feeding. Creep feeding is a tried and true method to introducing pigs to solid feed prior to weaning so that they start to get familiar while still on mom. The only challenge with creep feed is that it's labor intensive and you have creep feeders that are really hard to store and maintain and keep clean. So as part of my program, we asked ourselves, so what if we just take the mat that's already in the crate and we creep feed on the mat and then track performance in the nursery? And so what we did is we took the nursery diet and we made either a standard micro pellet or a large pellet. And so we know pigs like large pellets. They're like a puppy, so that large pellet is not just a food source, but it's also something that they can play with and interact with. They're curious creatures. So we had our 2 pelleted treatments that mirrored our nursery diet, and then we used lactation feed. If lactation feed works, that's great because it's already in the farrowing house and it eliminates a biosecurity risk. And then we tracked these pigs' performance in the nursery and then looked at removals mortalities. For the sake of time, we're just going to touch on removals mortalities since that's the focus of today's presentation. And so we have our 4 diets along the bottom here. What we saw is that when feeding a large pellet as the form of creep feed, we were able to significantly reduce the number of removals and mortalities in that pig population compared to when we fed a lactation feed as the form of creep feed, with either no creep or that standard micro pellet being intermediate. And so this discrepancy between our large pellet versus lactation is quite large, and so the question might be, why do you think we saw that? And part of the thought process here is, one, those pigs were weaned onto a crumble diet, so more similar to a pellet than a mash, so similarity in diet form. And then the other piece is similarity in diet formulation, right? So both of our pelleted diets was the nursery diet, just pelleted and then brought into the sow farm, whereas a lactation diet is a completely different formulation. And so now for strategy 3, we're moving away from that pre-weaning period into the post-weaning period once we start to think about receiving pigs into the barn. And so looking at the environment. So first and foremost, when we place pigs into a barn, we want to make sure we're pulling off the smallest 10% of pigs and putting them into a separate pen together. Research shows that smallest pigs get started better when they're penned with other small pigs, whereas large pigs are happy when they're with other groups of varying size pigs. Another piece that's really important is making sure that we take a subset of pens, whether it's 5 or 10% of your existing pens, and set them aside for your pull pens or hospital pens. This is a really important one. How many times do we walk into a barn and we walk through and we say, wow, this producer's doing a great job pulling pigs, and then you get to the pull pen and you realize the pull pen is overcrowded, there's way too many pigs, we're not doing any good for those pigs. So setting aside those pens and pulling pigs is really important, but also utilizing graduation pens becomes extremely important. Once that pig recovers, making sure we're getting them into a recovery pen. Optimum barn temperatures and ventilation set points. I think as an industry, there's a lot of opportunity here to better train our producers on what optimum ventilation looks like. If you and I walk into a barn and our eyes burn and it's hard to breathe, that pig is suffering from the same negative effects that we are, right? And then the last one, feeder hole, water space. I think this is one that maybe we really easily overlook, especially as we talk about different stocking strategies, and a lot of producers have moved to double stocking nurseries. The questions become, well, are we really giving those pigs a good opportunity to get started because we are double stocking at the very beginning? So strategy 4, feed. So when we think about the weaned pig, their gut is underdeveloped, right? And so they're not producing enough of the acid that's needed to fully break down and utilize intact protein that's coming from soybean meal. And so as a result of that, we try as nutritionists to feed a diet that is highly digestible, so has other sources of protein, in order for them to more readily utilize what they're consuming. The other part of a nursery diet that's really important is making sure it's palatable. We want something that tastes good and smells good. And so the question becomes with feed, if we do move to an older wean age pig, do we actually need to continue feeding a complex diet? And so 2019, this is a trial that Pipestone did where they looked at a high complex diet and a low complex diet over a young 20-day wean old pig or a 25-day wean old pig. And so first, I'll draw your attention here to the wean age by diet interactive p-values, since I don't have the means listed here. What you can see is that there's no difference. Regardless if that pig was young or if that pig was old, some level of diet complexity is still really important. So then if we just hone in on high complexity versus low complexity diet, what you can see here is by feeding a higher complexity diet, we were able to significantly improve average daily gain. Part of this was a result of a tendency for improved feed intake, but really where we're seeing this improvement is in feed efficiency, right? So again, highly digestible, highly palatable diet that's easy for that pig to utilize. And so the next question on the feed front then is, okay, so we need a high complex diet, but what about the budget, right? As a nutritionist, we feed specific budgets for specific time periods of that pig's production life cycle. And so the question became, okay, we're gonna take a 24 wean day pig, an older wean age pig, and we're gonna use our normal budget program, phase 1, 2, and 3, and then we're going to actually have a treatment where we skip past phase 1 and go right on phase 2. So phase 1's the most expensive diet and it's also the smallest budget. And so maybe we don't need it for an older wean age pig. And what we saw here is that by skipping that first budget, we significantly reduced the average daily gain of these pigs in the nursery. And then when we carried it out to 28 days post-placement and just looked at percentage of full value pigs, although not significant, there was 2% less full value pigs leaving that nursery compared to when we fed that normal budget all the way through. So for me, I fully believe whether that pig's 20 days old or 25 days old and they're getting pulled off the sow, their stomach, their gut is still used to seeing an only liquid diet, milk from mom. And so they do need that little bit of transition time with that phase 1 as they start to get acclimated to what solid feed is. And so moving into strategy 5, feed management strategies. Mat feeding is something that most producers do, but up until a couple years ago, we really didn't have a whole lot of data backing up why we do it. And so during my program, we did 3 different mat feeding studies, and so this is just the sum of all 3 of them, looking at control, no mat feeding versus mat feeding. And what we saw here is that by mat feeding, for 10 days post-placement, 3 times a day, we were able to significantly reduce the percentage of removals and mortalities in that population of pigs compared to when we did not mat feed at all. And then the next strategy, I don't have a research trial to show you on this one, but gruel feeding. I think this is an excellent tool if it's done correctly, and I would say 95% plus of the time it is not done correctly. And so just a little bit of information on how we would recommend mat feeding today, or excuse me, gruel feeding. So gruel feeding should be given to hospital or fallback pig pens. If you feel like you can get it done and get it done well, you can also do this to your small population of pigs if you have 1 or 2 of those pens. Gruel feed should be located centrally in the pen somewhere near the feed and water source, right? Because the goal is when they go to the gruel feeder, not all of them can necessarily fit around the gruel feeder, so they're getting up, and hopefully it's driving them then to the feed and water that's in that pen. Gruel feed, similar to mat, should be done anywhere from 2 to 4 times per day, up to 7 days post-placement, or really that window where you're starting to get a lot of fallback pigs. And then how do we make gruel? I think this is the most important one. Oftentimes you'll walk into a nursery and you'll see a gruel feeder that is chocked full, looks like it hasn't been touched in a couple hours, and there's a bunch of flies on it. So goal for gruel feed is oatmeal consistency. You want to fill that gruel feeder half or less full, because the goal is that within 30 minutes those pigs have licked it clean. If we're leaving feed that begins to spoil and is covered in flies, you're hurting that vulnerable pig that's already struggling more than helping them. And then the last point is, when you're mixing up gruel feed, it's really important to acknowledge that you don't want to soak the pen as well, because those pigs are already struggling and then now you're chilling them. Okay, and so then our last strategy for today is genetics. And so when we think about the genetic pie, right, we think about what we select for, what genetic companies select for. When you select for one thing, you're automatically going to deselect for something else, right? We can't have it all. And so for the last decade, we've really been focused on finishing pig performance. We want a pig that grows fast and grows efficiently. And so we've focused on selecting for the top end of that genetic curve, and haven't stopped to ask the question, what are we doing to the bottom half of that genetic curve? And so this trial was designed to answer that question. We took one genetic line and we selected 2 Duroc sires, one that was high indexing for good early nursery performance, and then the other that was high indexing for late grow finish performance. And then we tracked the progeny from birth until market. And so because all of this surrounds stress and how can we reduce stress to improve growth and mortality, one thing we wanted to look at was blood cortisol. And so what we did is on the day prior to weaning, we selected a subset of pigs from each population. We took blood cortisol levels, and what we saw is that regardless of progeny, their blood cortisol was right around 30 nanograms per milliliter. Then, post-weaning, once those pigs were placed in the nursery, 30 minutes later, that same subset of pigs, we bled them again and looked at blood cortisol. And what we saw is that in both populations, we saw an increase in cortisol levels. So we're seeing the result of the stress event. But the part of it that was really interesting was that we saw a greater spike in cortisol for our late maturing pigs compared to that of our early maturing pigs. And so right off the bat, we're seeing a stress response difference between these two populations. And so the next question becomes, what does that mean for performance? And so what we did is over the first 14 days, we looked at daily feed intake in these two populations. And so the first thing to point out is day 1, 24 hours. Post-weaning, these pigs consumed under 50 grams, so they're consuming nothing. And so that's just a really good note for us in our mind. What should expectation be for feed intake of a weaned pig right after weaning? It's very low. And so by day 2, we started to see a steady increase, and then an increase thereafter in daily feed intake. But the interesting piece is, once again, our early maturing pigs had significantly greater daily feed intake compared to our late maturing pigs. And so then, of course, the next question is, what does that mean for growth? And so in most of the studies that I was involved with, we weighed pigs 3 days post-weaning and looked at the percentage of that population that lost weight during that period. And so this trial from day 0 to 3, the percentage of pigs in the early maturing population that lost weight was about 5.5% of those pigs, so fairly low. As compared to our late maturing population, nearly 40% of them by day 3 weighed less than what they did at weaning. And so then we tracked all the way through to market. I'm just going to show you the end of nursery, but what we saw for final body weights when we move these pigs into the finisher is that our early maturing pig was about 10 pounds heavier compared to that of our early maturing pig. And so we're seeing a huge difference in how these pigs are getting started in the nursery and growing just based on their genetic potential. And so in summary for you guys today, I know that was a lot of rapid fire, high-level overview. The question that I would pose is not necessarily how do we minimize fallback pigs, but how do we reduce the different stressors that lead to a fallback pig, right? And so today, pre-weaning, we covered creep feeding and wean age, but there's also a whole other list of strategies we can think about. How are we utilizing holding nurseries if that's something that the sow farms you work with today utilize? Nurse sow utilization, teats, if we can get pigs started really well in the beginning, that's going to have a positive effect later on. And then post-weaning strategies that we covered today would be environment. How are we utilizing pens? What feeding program is in place? How can we mat feed and gruel feed in the best way possible? And then genetics. And so then the last piece that I will leave with you guys today, and if you take away anything, I would say these 3 bullets are just take you right back to the basics. Is the most important thing we need to do is understand the pig that we're weaning. If we can understand the source of that pig, we can understand what its potential health challenges are, what its genetics are, what its wean age are. And so once we have that information, then we can understand the basic needs of that individual pig, right? So maybe that pig needs a larger phase 1 budget. Maybe that pig needs a higher set point at placement as far as temperature goes. Maybe that pig needs to be started on antibiotics as soon as they're placed. And so understanding the pig help us understand what that pig needs, and then ultimately, as nutritionists, as veterinarians, as people that work directly with producers every day, it's our job then to use that information to empower the people in the barn to care for that animal well, right? So all this goes back to the people. None of it matters if you don't have a person in the barn who's willing to take the time and energy to get that pig started on feed initially. And so with that, I don't know where I'm at in time, but be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Madie. We have 10 minutes for questions.
Nice job. That was a really practical proposition and summary of solutions, I guess, for this problem. I was wondering, while you presented the data on creep feeding and the grueling and the mat feeding, what are the economics behind that? Because that has a cost, right? And how you balance that? Because it can be $3, $4, $5 more per pig. Would that really be a profit in there?
Yeah.
It's worth it.
Yeah, that's a good question. And so I don't have specific economics for you on any of those strategies. And so all of those trials, there was no difference in growth performance. And so it really depends on what your economic calculator looks like and how you value growth over mortality, right? And so growth performance, there was no positive impacts. Where we saw the impacts in most of these trials would be on removals and mortalities. And so unfortunately, we weren't able to take the number of removed pigs or morbid pigs that ended up dying. We weren't able to track that in some of these studies. And so what it boils down to is the cost of that feed, right, versus the number of pigs that you save as a result. And so pig price, feed cost, but I don't have a number for you. I would say it's probably not the most, you're not going to make the decision to do it based on necessarily an economic advantage, unless you can save pigs.
Thank you, Madie. One question I have is any updates or new information in terms of pertaining to stress, vaccines, comparisons of one maybe less stressful or harmful, timing of vaccines? How does that play into this, particularly during this stressful time of weaning?
Yeah. It's a good question. I don't have any updates on research necessarily in that area. I think there's a lot of opportunity in that pre-weaning period. We have our standard production practices today, and that's just the way it is, and that's the way it has been. And I think we do have opportunities to start to get creative about how we manage pigs prior to weaning. And so, as you mentioned, whether it's vaccine timing or if we start to think about, are there opportunities to commingle pigs before we put them on a truck and wean them, or Pipestone's done a lot of work with how we utilize nurse sows and has seen some positive results there. And so I don't have necessarily any updates. I have a lot of ideas that I could share, but no concrete updates.
Question from my side. Can you take me through your thinking, the thought process behind using a lactation feed as a creep feed under the sow and then transitioning from a lactation feed, which is quite high in soya, on the ability of that piglet to digest that soya, and the transitioning of a lactation feed to a first phase creep feed around that period? Why would you do that?
Yep, thought process was, there was one production company that we had conversations with that had done a trial looking at that and saw a positive response, and they were starting to do that in some of their farms. So one was to validate some of that information. The other piece is, so bringing creep feed onto a farm it is a biosecurity risk. And so that sow lactation feed's already on the farm. And so the thought process was, if we can eliminate a biosecurity risk, get a similar response with lactation feed, then we're going to go and try and see what happens. As a result of the study, I mean, I wouldn't probably say that's the route to go, but that was the thought process.
On your mat feeding trial, did you have an amount of feed per pig or amount of feed per event that you tried to?
Yeah, we
get in front of
did.
them?
I can't remember off the top of my head. I want to say it ended up being somewhere between around 600 grams, I think, was like the cup that we used. So it was a cup this big, fill it full, scoop it out of the back of the feeder, and then lay it in a straight line across the mat.
For 60 pigs, 30 pigs?
Oh, yeah, those pens would have been, I think, like 36 pigs.
Okay.
Kind of as a follow-up to that question, I'm wondering, with your large pellets, did you have less wastage? So maybe more of it was eaten by the pigs compared to the other ones that they could, anyway, do a lot of stuff with other than eat it.
Yeah, so that's a really good question. That was also one of the thoughts behind the large pellet. It's not going to fall through the crates, the crated floor. We did still have a hard time getting them to stay in the crates, just because like the gaps in the front and back of the crate, they play with them and push them out. And so most of the time you'd creep feed, and then within 30 minutes later you'd walk back through and it would be gone, no matter the diet form. So it did last longer than the little micro pellets, just because they run through it and it's gone. But it's still.
So you don't know whether it's feed intake?
Yes.
For the type of.
Disappearance. Yeah, feed intake.
Curious to know, are there incentive in the sow farm today that inadvertently are increasing the number of fallback pigs that we send out? Maybe other pigs that shouldn't be going to a truck, that today maybe promote to go to a truck, way we incentivize the farm.
Yeah.
And are there farms, nursery farms that you say, and what characteristic will have a nursery that you say, this nursery farm will take these pigs and no problem, versus this other farm that whatever I send there is going to struggle?
Yeah, I think that's a complicated question. There's no incentive at the sow farm level for them to make their life more complicated in order to prevent fallback pigs in the nursery. There's an incentive from a body weight standpoint, right? There's a cutoff. You're not supposed to send pigs over or under 8 pounds. And so there's the potential for grade offs there, and they just don't get the value for those pigs. So that would be the only incentive in place today. And then as far as knowing one barn versus another who's going to have more fallbacks, really boils down to a number of the different things we talked about today, right? Is who the producer is in the barn, how healthy those pigs are, et cetera.
So, quick question. I know when I think about high complexity feeds that I generally think of feeds that are somewhat smaller on a molecular size. But one thing I'm kind of curious about, because we also have to worry about the economics of feed, is, do we see anything in the data? I mean, I've heard some stuff anecdotally through some company data from time to time that sometimes if we have highly complex or low costing diets that might be exacerbating pre-weaning diet, or not pre-weaning, but post-wean diarrhea.
Yeah. So there's going to be post-weaning diarrhea can occur as a result of, there's dietary things that can cause post-weaning diarrhea that if you're feeding really high lactose levels for a long period of time, and maybe too much soybean meal right off the bat. And so, can you ask your question again? I'm sorry.
I guess just the thought there is the reason I asked was there was an anecdotal story of basically two people doing different diets. One did a very classic
Sure.
nursery diet, and another person did one that was more of like a lower cost diet. And while technically they both performed the same, it was observed by some of the workers that the pigs that were on this cheaper diet had a higher incidence of diarrhea occurring, which then made me think about like the environmental concerns of all these nutrients essentially just going out the back end too.
Yep.
But when we have these different types of diets, are we exacerbating some of that diarrhea to occur without necessarily intending to?
Yeah, and I think yes. I think it's been interesting when we talk about like research Pipestone's done and the research other people do. Sometimes you can do the same exact trial, get completely different, right? And so it gets hard. I think the low complex diets oftentimes have more soybean meal, which we know can upset the gut. But then if you feed a high complex diet for too long, that can also upset the gut. And so there's lots of different factors. At the end of the day, I think a lot of producers, they want growth, but performance is not necessarily the most important thing right off the bat in the nursery. Producer's gonna be more concerned with, I cannot get my pigs to stop scouring. Can you help me with this? And so from a nutrition perspective, at least in our barns, we're constantly asking ourselves, like our number one research objective is, how can we improve fecal consistency? And that's really hard to answer and to objectively score. So I don't know if I necessarily answered your question, but.
Thank you, Madie, for a good presentation. Lots of your work was done in your PhD around the Pig Livability Project, and I think from a nutritional standpoint, and there is opportunity for hope in reducing piglet mortality. So really good, well put together presentation. In your early and late developing pig lines, not only was there a difference in cortisol and average daily gain, was there also a difference in mortality in those two piglet lines?
No, so there wasn't. That would have been done at the university level, and so too small of a population to be able to look at mortality.
Again, sorry, another question from my side here. Have you included birth weight as part of your piglet vitality in doing these studies, as a lot of the research showing that piglet birth weight can explain a lot of this? And there's a big difference why a piglet can be a fallback. If it's a fallback because it's a low birth weight piglet, the research shows that piglet just don't have the ability to recover or do anything. It doesn't matter what kind of treatment you or circumstances you expose those piglets to. But if it's a piglet that's or suckling, a good birth weight piglet suckling at a back teat, and because of that it become a fallback, that piglet do have the ability to recover and still become a full value pig. Are you including and looking at birth weight in the interactions of birth weights of piglets in your studies?
Yeah, so none of these studies would have looked at that. I think it's an excellent point, and goes back to just how complex fallback pigs are and where it's actually stemming from. But none of these studies, would have went back to that piglet birth weight.
Well, help me again in thanking Dr. Farmer and Dr. Wensley for wonderful presentations.